Carlos Lehder is not as popular of a character as Pablo Escobar, but if it wasn't for Lehder, the world might have never known about the most famous drug lord in history. Lehder was directly responsible for Escobar becoming as rich as he did. He revolutionized the cocaine trade and imported tons of drugs into America, something which no one had done before. Carlos Lehder was directly involved in importing 80% of all cocaine that was imported into the States. He saw America as a rotting society and wanted to destroy it with the help of drugs. He made astronomical sums of money, counting in the billions of dollars, both for himself and for the drug lords. The ludicrous amount of money allowed him to do whatever he wanted, even practically buying his own island, on which he organized crazy orgies with dozens of people that lasted several days. Lehder was a madman who idolized Hitler and was a fan of John Lennon. He even established a neo-Nazi party, planning to eventually overthrow the Colombian government. Carlos was loved and hated. He was considered both intelligent and a jester, and ultimately became the enemy not only of America, but also of his friends. From a small-time drug dealer to the king of drug trafficking, his life was incredibly bright, dangerous, and interesting, as was its end. Carlos Lehder was born in Armenia, Colombia, but wasn't a typical Colombian. His father was a German who immigrated from the fatherland to rural Colombia at the end of the 1920s. He made significant contributions to the development of engineering in the country and participated in the construction of several buildings that had elevators, a rather modern and unusual technology at that place and time. The prominent German soon met a beautiful Colombian woman, a former beauty queen, and they got married. Carlos was born on September 7, 1949, and was the third of 4 children in the family. Even before Carlos' birth, his engineer father and teacher mother owned a small hotel restaurant where German immigrants regularly met. The family also had a small business producing vegetable oils and importing luxury goods such as wine and canned goods. Carlos was born into an affluent family and wasn't in need of money, unlike many of his peers. He did become interested in another topic, however. From childhood, he began to hate America. Largely facilitated by his father, who was an ardent supporter of the Nazis, the family got in hot water when during World War II, U.S. intelligence investigated him, as well as many other Germans living in Colombia. Among his family, his father did not particularly keep quiet about Nazi sympathies, and all this was, of course, absorbed by his sons, including Carlos. When Carlos was 15, he was forced to move to Colombia to, that's right, the despised US of A. His father and mother, having been married for many years, nevertheless divorced. As a result, his mother, looking for a better life, emigrated to New York, taking young Carlos with her. Life in the States, which the young man loathed since childhood, was very different from life in Colombia. Compared to his homeland, the United States had everything. It was on a completely different, whole new level. Carlos didn't want to study in such conditions, so he dropped out of school, deciding to devote himself to petty hooliganism and earning money on the street. Moreover, now living in a new place without a father, the family had much fewer means of sustenance. Undoubtedly, having spent time in the harsh realities of the Colombian streets, Carlos had the experience and skills to make money illegally. But at such a young age and in an unfamiliar country, he could not engage in crime on his own. So he quickly got in touch with the Latin American community, which assigned him small tasks and could cover him if something happened. At first, the earnings were small, but gradually, Carlos moved on to more serious affairs. He started stealing cars and selling them abroad. The business was quite profitable, but it was possible to earn even more, so Lehder also sold marijuana along the way. Things went well for some time, but that didn't last long. He was soon caught smuggling 90 pounds of weed in the trunk of a stolen car. Carlos was going to prison. In 1974, Lehder began serving a 2-year sentence in a federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut. Considering the severity of his crimes, the Colombian got off easy. Besides, the prison turned out to not be as scary of a place as it seemed. On the contrary, for Carlos, the Danbury prison became a school of life and a genuine university of crime. There were no rapists, maniacs, or murderers. Doctors, lawyers, bankers, and even Native American chiefs served their sentences here. You could learn anything you needed about illegal activity. Carlos, who was just a petty swindler before going to prison, decided to take full advantage of the opportunity and communicated with everyone who could provide him with engaging information. Perhaps one of these people could give him a good idea and, upon release, Lehder could start a truly profitable business. But as it turned out, the Colombian didn't even have to look far, because such a person was already sitting in the same cell with him. This was George Young, the same man whose story is portrayed in the film Blow. Well-mannered and neat, and speaking good English, Lehder, as Young described him, quickly hit it off with his cellmate. In the beginning, it was an ordinary acquaintance as the cellmates sized each other up. But when Carlos finally found out what his roommate was in for, Lehder almost exploded with joy. He instantly came up with a brilliant plan that could earn them both crazy amounts of money, millions of dollars. George Young was arrested for smuggling marijuana, but Young was no ordinary small-time smuggler. He knew how to transport huge shipments without being noticed. To do this, he used light single-engine aircraft that could fly below the radar. Undoubtedly, George earned a lot of money even from weed, but it was nowhere close to the ridiculous sums of money that could be made from transporting another drug, cocaine. At the time, the cocaine market in the States was just emerging, but Lehder already knew enough about the drug to know that he really wanted in on it to make some serious cash. He was born and raised in Colombia, where the drug was produced, and had long lived in the States where cocaine was in greatest demand and sold for the highest price. Carlos was the perfect player in this business. The only problem was transportation. When he met George Young, the transportation problem was solved overnight. One day, they started a conversation, during which Carlos asked the cellmate if he knew anything about cocaine. Young said no, and asked to tell him more about the drug. Carlos said that it sells for $60,000 per kilo in the States. George was surprised. "How much does it cost in Colombia then?" he asked. Lehder's answer shocked his cellmate. Carlos said that in Colombia, a kilo of cocaine costs many times less, only $4,000 to $5,000. The cash register in George Young's head immediately started ringing. By transporting tens or even hundreds of kilograms of cocaine, he and Carlos could get rich very quickly. From that moment on, the two cellmates conversed with each other almost continuously every day, developing a large-scale plan for the future of the cocaine business. Carlos became obsessed with the idea and spent all his free time in prison studying all aspects of the business. Even before hatching the plan, Carlos constantly talked with bankers and other knowledgeable people, but now he began to question them with even more fervor and focus. Lehder inquired about money laundering, cars, studied navigation, and the banking system of America, and constantly, like a fanatic, wrote everything down. The business was planned and studied to the smallest degree. All that was now left was to get out of prison. Once free, the companions got right to it. They needed a plane, and to acquire one, they needed substantial starting capital. To obtain it, George Young found 2 American girls and persuaded them to fly with him to Antigua and bring back cocaine in their suitcases. Sounds too simple, but this was the middle of the 70s, and not as many people knew about cocaine as they do now, and it wasn't all that hard to transport it. In the body of the suitcases was a plastic fiberglass shell. It sat upon the drugs and the lip of the suitcase riveted around it. It was virtually undetectable. The operation was successful. Surprisingly, the girls enjoyed Lehder's and Young's company so much that they returned and offered to continue transporting the drug-filled suitcases. So, having made 2 trips in the shortest possible time, the partners collected the required amount of money and bought a plane. They hired a professional pilot who had connections in the Bahamas and who knew exactly what to do if any problems arose. At that time, most of the cocaine coming into the United States was not by aircraft, but rather brought in with suitcases and in small amounts, like what was done by the two girls, or it was brought in by people body packing it. Lehder's and Young's shipment was the first known case of when a massive quantity of cocaine was brought into the USA by air. When everything was said and done, George and Carlos not only made a bucket load of money, but also officially revolutionized the drug trade. The partners started pulling off such forays over and over. Sometimes Carlos himself would sit at the controls of the plane, as before prison, he attended aviation courses in the States where he learned to skillfully control both an airplane and a helicopter. Besides, Lehder knew the islands through which the route ran very well. The small prop planes, which would later be suspended by small jets, transported drugs from Colombia and flying at low altitudes deliver the cocaine to Georgia, Florida, and North and South Carolina. As it turned out, Carlos was not only adept at piloting, but was also extremely charismatic, which helped him persuade and bribe powerful people in Colombia, the Bahamas, as well as the other neighboring islands. The plane couldn't fly from Colombia to the States without refueling, which meant that it had to land somewhere along the way. Having dropped the cargo onto a pre-designated boat, most often the plane flew to Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas Islands, to refuel. Lehder and Young bribed local officials to keep them out of their business. When drugs were finally delivered to America, they were most commonly distributed either by vans or by simple personal vehicles. Young and Lehder had a building where drugs were received and unloaded, and from there transported to distributors. One of the most popular methods was the so-called car exchange. A car full of cocaine drove up to a specific point, after which the driver of the cocaine car got out of his car and got into another one that was standing nearby. As a rule, the buyer was sitting in the other car. He did the exact same thing, got out of his car and got into the other car that was full of drugs. After the exchange, the buyer took the product to San Francisco, California, New York, or wherever else, and street dealing began from there. Lehder and Young didn't take any part in slanging drugs on the streets. That's not what they found interesting. The key was that everything was perfectly organized and properly encrypted. Nobody knew any names, everything was coded, and the former cellmates tried to make the entire process from loading the drugs all the way to the buyer as clean as possible. As a result, the friends had loads of cash, women, and a successful business. They lived and did what they wanted. It was unforgettable. But such success could not go unnoticed for long. Soon, Carlos and George found themselves on the radar of drug lords from Medellin, among whom the practically unknown at the time Pablo Escobar stood out. Collaboration with people like Gacha, Ochoa brothers, and Escobar could provide what Carlos Lehder crucially needed: an uninterrupted supply of drugs. For the drug lords who were stuck in the Stone Age of drug smuggling and using a variety of high-risk, low-reward methods of transportation, the cooperation was beneficial in that they could now transport several times more cocaine and do it with much less risk. Lehder and Young took care of the transportation and distribution, while Escobar handled production in his Colombian laboratories. Profits increased substantially. But these enormous sums of money only corrupted Carlos. As his wealth and status grew, the Colombian native became known for his eccentric behavior, uncontrollable aggression, and active support of Hitler and John Lennon. Lehder, always hating America and wishing the worst for it, saw the cocaine trade as a way to sow chaos in the States and destroy the political system. He began to develop delusions of grandeur. It got to the point that Carlos began to think about buying an island somewhere in the Bahamas. In truth, it wasn't a crazy idea at all. By owning an island, Lehder could greatly improve logistics, conduct business more freely, and greatly increase supplies. As a result, without the knowledge of his partner George Young, Carlos bought 165 acres of land on the Bahamian island of Norman's Cay. Young did not like this development and believed that such publicity would eventually attract trouble. Constantly on drugs, Carlos became uncontrollable and increasingly made decisions with which Young did not agree. By the end, their relationship soured so much that Carlos forced his friend out of his business with threats. George was furious and even thought about killing his former partner. Escobar found out about the possible hit and categorically forbade carrying through with it, arguing that by killing Carlos, serious problems would begin with the business. When Young cooled down, the drug lord invited him to work independently of Lehder, still transporting cocaine to America. Granted, it was much less money than what Carlos was now making, but it was still in the millions of dollars. In fact, this was the best course of action for Young, as he now could calmly conduct his business without communicating with the distraught Lehder. But for Lehder himself, parting with his partner did not bode well for the future. George Young was the person Carlos listened to and the one who could bring him to his senses and rein him in if something happened. Now, nothing was stopping him, and the island of Norman's Cay became the personification of permissiveness and madness that consumed Carlos Lehder. Before Lehder arrived in 1978, Norman's Cay was a private resort. Excursions to this island were available exclusively to rich people. Access to it required a yacht or a small plane, but for a number of reasons, the island never established itself as a popular tourist destination. To ensure that the Bahamian government would not interfere, the drug lords wrote them large checks. Carlos, Escobar, and the other cartel members even created a special fund from which the government of the Bahamas received money for reforms, which were necessary, as back in 1973 the islands separated from the British and gained independence. Immediately upon arrival, Lehder began buying up as much real estate as possible. In addition to the magnificent seaside estate, he built a 1,000-meter airstrip and aircraft hangars, installed radars, and brought in armed guards and attack dogs to patrol the beaches and protect cargo. Any pilots, excluding Lehder's smugglers, who tried to land on the island were immediately driven away by the guards. With the government of the Bahamas in his back pocket, Lehder had almost complete control of Norman's Cay. His goal was to ultimately drive out the current inhabitants and make the island the capital of his cocaine empire. For those who were initially reluctant to leave the island and sell their property, Lehder conducted a series of underhanded operations to try to intimidate the owners into leaving the island. Some residents would come to the docks to find the ropes of their boats mysteriously torn or the water in their cisterns tainted. There was even one case where a resident found his dog floating in his water tank. Perhaps the defining moment when residents realized the island was no longer safe came in July 1980, when a yacht belonging to a former Fort Myers couple was found adrift off the island with a dead body and bloodstains on board. The island was located around 210 miles off the coast of Florida. Its location was perfect for drug running. Of course, buying a large Boeing, loading it with hundreds of tons of cocaine in Colombia, flying it to America, and landing at the Miami airport would have been ideal. But obviously, that was impossible. Even without a 747, with the help of smaller planes, at the height of Lehder's power, hundreds of kilograms of cocaine were being imported and exported from Norman's Cay every day and amounted to millions of dollars in profit. Lehder earned staggering amounts of money, with conservative estimates ranging from $250 to $300 million a year. This much money was enough to make a person insane, which is exactly what was gradually happening with Carlos. Lehder regularly threw parties with cocaine and booze that lasted for days. He and his henchmen walked around the island naked, lit giant bonfires on the beach, and did all sorts of outlandish activities. Carlos brought prostitutes in by the plane load and organized massive orgies that lasted for God knows how long. One day, Lehder invited his friend to come to the island, and, getting off the plane, his chum saw the following picture. An incredibly beautiful girl who was supposed to pick him up and take him to Carlos was driving up to him in an extremely stylish car. Everything would have been fine if not for the fact that the girl was butt naked. Carlos' mate was taken aback by what he saw. But upon arrival at the host's house, he was shocked even further. 5 men and 10 women, all naked, all changing partners, drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana. It was insanity. The absolute lawlessness and chaos on Norman's Cay attracted a lot of unnecessary attention. Although the government of the Bahamas received bribes, it could not turn a blind eye to everything that was happening, given that American law enforcement agencies were increasingly becoming interested in the island. Bahamian authorities warned Lehder that they would occasionally make arrests to make it appear they had everything under control. One time, the Bahamian police even staged a massive raid on the island, during which 30 people were arrested. And yet, Carlos wasn't afraid of the Bahamian police in the slightest, since he knew that no one was going to arrest him. His main fear was the Americans, namely the super agency that was created in 1973 to solve all problems related to drugs, in other words, the DEA. They were truly the only force capable of coming to Norman's Cay, depriving Lehder of his business, putting him in prison, and extraditing him to America. Thus, to protect himself, Carlos came to an agreement with Bahamian authorities that if the Americans decided to arrive on the island and seize him, the government would warn Lehder about it in advance. The government said, "You'll get a signal from us when it gets too hot and you need to leave. You will lose the island, but you and your people will be safe." Both Carlos and his team believed it. They partied like crazy and did whatever they wanted, knowing that no one would touch them. One phone call from the Bahamian government and the island would have been empty. To not be caught with his pants down, Carlos decided to prepare several escape plans in advance. For example, if the DEA decided to land a helicopter or plane, the planes on the ground, runway, or other infrastructure on the island would have been blown up. Numerous boats, speedboats, and all kinds of equipment were purchased. Lehder, increasingly consumed by drugs and ludicrous amounts of money, had occasional periods of sobriety where he showed real signs of genius and demonstrated how highly developed his organizational abilities were. Nevertheless, trouble did eventually come, and not from where it was expected, but from Colombia. In 1979, Colombian guerrilla groups turned to kidnapping drug millionaires for ransom due to their huge cash reserves and their inability to seek legal recourse. The first to be kidnapped was Marta Ochoa, the sister of a well-known drug lord, brothers in Medellin. The next was Carlos Lehder, who, on one of his rare trips to Colombia, was captured and brought to the jungle. There is very little available information about Carlos' time in captivity. The only detail we do have is that he managed to escape with the assistance of an accomplice, even though he did end up being wounded in the leg. A meeting of the main participants of the Medellin cartel was immediately convened, during which a special group called MAS was created, which in Spanish is the acronym for Death to Kidnappers, announcing the imminent execution of any guerrilla kidnappers. It was truly a time to be a kidnapper. They began to be hunted. When Lehder's men brought him one of the guerrillas, the bandaged drug lord picked up a pistol, aimed, and before firing said, "I just wanted to say goodbye to you." The manhunt for the guerrillas ended with Marta Ochoa being released a couple of months later. Realizing what they got themselves into, the kidnappers themselves took the drug lord's sister back to Medellin by car and dropped her off in the city, without as much as a scratch on Marta. The kidnappings further strengthened the alliance in the Medellin cartel, and Carlos Lehder felt even more powerful. As Lehder's drug addiction worsened and his influence grew, so did his delusions. He became obsessed with studying the principles of Nazism and spent hours planning the political takeover of the presidency of Colombia, but in the future did not want to limit himself to only Colombia. The rhetoric of his movement was based on a fascist communist fantasy that sought to take control of a country in a Fidel Castro-type revolution. He often praised Hitler and criticized Jews. Soon, Lehder committed a large mistake. During one of the regular Bahamian police raids, 5 Colombians were captured. Under pressure from the Americans, the government decided not to release them and instead sent them to prison. Carlos was furious. He boarded one of his planes, took boxes of paper flyers that said, "Go home DEA," and began throwing them out of the plane all over Nassau. This taunt was stupid and drew too much attention. The government of Bahamas stopped considering Lehder a serious person. His eccentric behavior began to worry his Medellin colleagues. The DEA began breathing down his neck, and finally, in 1982, in response to U.S. pressure, the government of the Bahamas began to suppress all Lehder's actions on Norman's Cay. With his stupid antics, publicity, and carelessness, Carlos personally ruined his business on the island, which for 4 years brought him a staggering income. As authorities closed in, Lehder set fire to his home, along with everything else associated with the cocaine trade, and fled to his homeland. He had his own plans for Colombia. Carlos returned to Armenia, the city in which he was born and raised, and immediately began to throw money around and establish his own rules. The first thing he did was buy a huge farm on the outskirts of the city, where he changed the structure of the La Posada Alamena restaurant, turning it into a luxury hotel complex. In front of his house, Carlos installed a bronze statue of his beloved John Lennon, depicting him with a guitar and wearing nothing but a Nazi helmet. To improve relations with the government of the Department of Quindío, in which Lehder resided, he bought them a modern aircraft. The strange gift took the department's ruling class by surprise, and right up to the president, the question arose of what to do with the plane. In the end, the aircraft was officially legalized with the approval of the Ministry of Government. Having buttered up the officials, Carlos wanted power and, it seems, was seriously considering the plan to seize the government that had long tormented him. But before he proceeded, he had to show the ordinary people who he was. In 1982, the drug lord entered the political scene in Quindío and formed a neo-Nazi party called the National Latin Movement, which, apart from wanting to set up a neo-Nazi government in Colombia, took aim at Colombia's extradition treaty. The movement gained more than 10,000 followers in the department of Quindío, had widespread support in small towns, and had considerable influence in the country's major cities. Carlos held press conferences, publicly supported Hitler, and condemned American intervention. He even bought one of the Colombian newspapers, using it to actively conduct propaganda campaigns. The newspaper published every stupidity that came to Lehder's mind. For example, Coca-Cola was the only good thing about imperialism, and Hitler was the greatest warrior in history. The Jews, he wrote, were not killed by the Nazis during World War II, but rather died only while working in the fields and factories. The drug lord did not filter anything he wrote or said. It got to the point where Lehder publicly admitted that he was selling cocaine. Gradually, people began to listen to him less and less, rightly believing that Carlos was a windbag and a clown. Around the same time that Lehder got into politics, Pablo Escobar followed suit. But, unlike his lunatic partner, Escobar did everything much more properly and took the matter seriously. And yet, having received a seat in the Colombian Congress, he was unable to hide his past. Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla began seriously investigating Escobar's income and quickly brought it to light. The result was detrimental for both. The drug lord was expelled from Congress, and the Justice Minister was killed by a gang of bandits on motorcycles. This hit was a massive mistake, since no one doubted who was behind the assassination. The president of Colombia, who had previously opposed extradition, announced, "We will extradite Colombians." The first person on that list was not Escobar, but Carlos Lehder. Now, with the Colombian government, in conjunction with the United States, hunting him, it left him no time for delusional speeches. During one of the raids on Lehder's home, police found a suitcase containing $1.6 million. The entire house was decorated with photos and memorabilia of Adolf Hitler, whom the drug lord idolized. Carlos, being as impudent as ever, of course no longer in the house, accused the police of stealing the difference, since according to him, there was not $1.6 million, but $1.8 million in the house. For some time, Lehder hid in the Chile jungle, and, despite the seriousness of the situation, still behaved insolently, giving secret interviews to the press and challenging his partners. Carlos tried to negotiate with the government, claiming that he would pay off the whole Colombian national debt if the president refused extradition. But it was all in vain. The government wasn't going to have anything to do with a crazy clown who transported dozens of tons of cocaine. The Medellin cartel also did not want anything to do with him, seeing him as a burden and no longer respecting him. Now that the drug lords could be extradited to an American prison, the cartel wanted to be more restrained, but that was not Carlos' style. Besides, if he was previously immensely valuable for the business, presently that usefulness all but dissipated. Carlos was no longer involved in drug transportation, and the drug lords had to look for other options, the most popular of which being the route through Panama. To help them accomplish it, the Panamanian general Manuel Noriega actively aided the activity. Lehder would soon once again remind the Medellin drug lords of his uncontrollable personality, and it was this incident that became his last straw. With the adoption of an extradition treaty, the Medellin cartel was in deep water. The drug lords waged their struggle and tried with all their might to force the Colombian government to abandon the treaty. But the drug lords wouldn't be themselves if, even in such precarious conditions, did not throw lavish parties. Carlos Lehder was also invited to have a good time. Despite all the differences and violent temper, he was still their partner, the soul and heart of the organization. When the party began to come to an end, almost everyone scattered to their rooms. Carlos went to a room where a prostitute and a mountain of cocaine were waiting for him. Everyone knew that disturbing Carlos, especially at times like these, was a bad idea. Among those for whom the party was not yet over was Escobar's henchman, a sicario named Royo. He was craving drugs so badly that he went upstairs and knocked on Carlos' door, knowing for sure that Lehder had what he needed. An irritated Carlos, with no desire to be distracted, opened the door after some time and shot Royo. People, including Pablo, ran to where the gunshots were heard and saw a dead body riddled with bullets. Carlos apologized to Escobar, but that didn't change anything. Pablo was determined to get rid of the crazy drug addict who had previously already caused heaps of problems and now even started killing Pablo's men. Perhaps the easiest solution was to simply kill Lehder, but Escobar decided to act more subtly. To sweeten the pill for himself before authorities, the drug lord decided to surrender Carlos. The very next day, Lehder was captured by the Colombian National Police. Everything was planned and organized by Lehder's former colleagues, who were simply tired of him. Later, in a letter that Escobar wrote for public viewing, he denied that it was his tip that got Carlos arrested. There were even theories that Lehder was turned in by his mistress, or that the investigation itself was on the trail of the drug lord. But Carlos knew full well that it was his own people who betrayed him. But that wasn't important now. Being the first big fish to be caught, law enforcement agencies decided to make Lehder an example and went full out on him. After capture, Carlos spent only 8 hours in Colombia before being extradited to the States. Carlos was taken by surprise. Even knowing full well about the extradition, he was almost sure that he would be left in a Colombian prison. After all, before him, Colombia hadn't extradited a single drug trafficker. Unfortunately for Lehder, he was the first. The extradition of such an influential drug lord could not go unnoticed, and for the authorities, using Lehder as an example, wanted to destroy the myth of the untouchability of drug lords. Besides, it was a chance to restore people's faith in the power of the state. In general, the extradition of Carlos Lehder was a high-profile sensation. After him, extradition became quite commonplace. Hundreds of drug dealers were sent to American prisons. Without drugs and alcohol, with which Carlos certainly closely collaborated in recent years, Lehder began to clearly understand the trouble he had gotten himself into. Knowing that Escobar had betrayed him, he offered to help the DEA in capturing the Medellin drug lord. To do this, he needed to return to Colombia. But the DEA didn't want to take any chances. If Carlos had returned to Colombia, there was a high chance that he could have escaped justice, and besides, no one wanted to believe the dodgy swindler. Lehder then decided to write a letter to the then Vice President George Bush, offering cooperation in exchange for immunity. But nothing came of this either. After a 7-month trial in federal court in Jacksonville, Lehder was sentenced to life in prison plus 135 years. It was a catastrophe. Lehder's trial was the largest trial against a foreign drug trafficker in the history of the United States at the time. During the trial, prosecutor Robert Merkel described Lehder as a man who was to the cocaine trade what Henry Ford was to the auto industry. The hefty prison term, according to law enforcement agencies, was supposed to signal the American public that the states would do everything in their power to get rid of this cancer, that is, cocaine. Those who interacted with Lehder in prison noted that Carlos was very intelligent, noting the prevailing qualities in him such as manipulation and cunning. And it was precisely these qualities that helped Carlos shorten his prison term. In 1991, after 3 years in prison, Lehder offered to testify against the Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, whom the Americans captured in Panama in early 1990 and brought to the United States. Carlos knew Noriega personally and revealed to the authorities, as they say, everything. Noriega was directly involved in many of the operations connected to the Medellin cartel and Pablo Escobar himself. Lehder's testimony had the desired effect, reducing his sentence to 55 years. But that was still too much. 3 years after Noriega was convicted, Lehder wrote a letter to a Jacksonville federal district judge, complaining that the U.S. had reneged on a deal to transfer him to a German prison. The letter did nothing to help Carlos and was interpreted as a threat against the judge. For many years, Lehder wrote letters to the Colombian government, filed appeals, and strained his lawyer, but it did little to help. He still remained in prison. Perhaps if Carlos had immediately pleaded guilty, he would have been released long ago. But as it was, he had to serve 33 years in prison. Yes, he did eventually get out. On June 15, 2020, when the former drug lord was already 70 years old, he was finally released in view of a serious illness. Carlos was deported to Germany because, thanks to his father, he retained German citizenship. There, he was met by his daughter, who did not give up on her father, even when he was in prison. After Lehder's release, the former U.S. attorney said, "He's old, but I wonder how much craziness he still has left." In truth, it's doubtful that the elderly Carlos would take up any illegal activity. After so many years in prison, he's simply enjoying his freedom and indulging in memories of his turbulent, eventful life. His whole life is a personification of the proverb, "It is better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep." Lehder was ruined by drugs and their effect on him, and the ensuing madness led to his downfall. One of the cornerstones of success for drug lords has always been that they themselves did not use cocaine, at least not in such quantities. But Lehder did the opposite. But compared to many of his colleagues, he remained alive and is spending his old age breathing the free air. True, not exactly where he would have liked, but to his beloved Colombia, where even now he still has many enemies. Carlos, it seems, will never return.